Hi, so we're ready for the final part of the Firework-Maker's daughter. So when we left off yesterday, Leela and Lalchand were just about to begin their display in the competition. The first thing that happened was that little lotus flowers made of white fire suddenly popped open on the water, with no hint of where the fire had come from. The audience fell silent, and when the flowers began to float across the dark lake like little paper boats, they were completely hushed. Then a beautiful green light began to glow beneath the water and rose slowly upwards to become a fountain of green fire. But it didn't look like fire, it looked like water, and it splashed and danced like a bubbling spring. And while the fountain played over the lake, something quite different was happening under the trees. A carpet of living moss seemed to have spread itself across the grass, a million little points of light all so close together that they looked as soft as velvet. A sort of ah sound came from the audience. Then came the most difficult part. Leela had designed a sequence of fireworks based on what she had seen in the grotto of the Fire Fiend, but it all depended on the delayed action fuses working as they should, and of course they hadn't had time to test them properly. If some of the fireworks went off a second too early or a second too late, the whole show would make no sense. But there was no time to worry about that now. Quickly and expertly, she and Lalchand touched fire to the end of the mass diffusers and held their breath. First came a series of slow, dull explosions, like the beat of a muffled drum. Everything was dark. Then a red light shivered downwards, leaving a trail of red sparks hanging in the air, like a crack opening in the night. The solemn drumbeats got louder and louder, and everyone sat very still, holding their breath, because of the irresistible feeling that something was going to happen. Then it did. Out of the red crack in the night, a great cascade of brilliant red, orange, and yellow lava seemed to pour down and spread out like the carpet of fire in the grotto. Leela couldn't resist glancing up very swiftly at Dr. Puffinflash, Signor Sorcerini, and Colonel Sparkington, and saw them all watching wide-eyed like little children. When the lava carpet had flowed down almost to the edge of the lake, the speed of the drumbeat got faster, and sharp bangs and cracks beat the air between them, and suddenly, dancing as he had in the grotto, Rizvani himself seemed to be there, whirling and stamping and laughing for joy in the play of the eternal fire. Both Leela and Lalchand forgot everything else and seized each other's hands and danced as well. Never had they produced such a display. No matter what happened, it was worth it. Everything was worth it for a moment of joy like this. They laughed and danced for happiness. But their fire was not Rizvani's, of course, and it couldn't last forever. The great red firework demon burnt himself out, and the last of the red lava poured slowly into the lake. And then the little white lotus boats, now scattered over the water like the stars in the sky, flared up and burnt more brightly than ever for a moment before all going out at once. Then there was silence. It was a silence that got longer and longer until Leela could hardly bear it, and she gripped Lalchand's hand so tightly it nearly cracked. And when she thought it was all over, Lalchand was doomed, everything was ruined, there came a mighty yell from Colonel Sparkington. "Yee-haw!" he cried, waving his hat. And "Bravissimo!" shouted Signor Sorcerini, clapping his hands above his head. And "Hush, hush, hush!" roared Dr. Puffinflash, seizing the cymbals from his bombardingen sparkum pump in order to clap more loudly. The audience, not to be out-applauded by the visiting firework-makers, joined in with such a roar and a stamping and a clapping and a thumping of one another on the back, and a whistling and a shouting, that 438 doves roosting in a tree 10 miles away woke up and said, "Did you hear that?" Of course, the court official timing the applause had to give up. It was obvious to everyone who had won, and Lalchand and Leela went up to the royal platform where the king was waiting to present the prize. "I keep my word," said the king quietly. "Lalchand, you are free. Take this prize, the pair of you, and enjoy the festival." Hardly knowing what was happening, Leela and Lalchand wandered back to the darkness of the firing area under the trees. And he might have been going to say something, and she might have spoken too. But suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of a mighty trumpet. "It's Hamlet," said Leela. "Look, he's excited about something." A moment later, they saw what the elephant had seen, and Leela clapped her hands for joy. A little figure came strolling down onto the grass in front of the royal platform and bowed elegantly to the king. It was Chulak. "Your Majesty," he said, and everyone stopped to hear what he was going to say. "In honour of your great wisdom and generosity to all of your subjects, and in celebration of your many glorious years on the throne, and in the hope of many even more glorious ones ahead, and as a tribute to the splendour of your courage and your dignity, and in recognition—" "He's on the verge of being cheeky," Lalchand said as Chulak went on. "I can see the king tapping his foot. That's a bad sign." "So, Your Majesty," Chulak finished, "I have the honour to present you a group of the finest magicians ever heard, who will sing a selection of vocal gems for your delight. Your Majesty, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, Rambashi's Melody Boys." "I don't believe it," said Leela, but she had to, because there were Rambashi's ex-pirates in person, wearing smart scarlet jackets and tartan sarongs. Rambashi himself, beaming all over his broad face, gave a deep bow and prepared to conduct them, but before he could begin, there was an interruption. One of the dancing girls who had accompanied the royal procession from the palace suddenly squealed and cried, "Chang!" And one of the Melody Boys held out his arms and cried, "Lotus Blossom!" "What did he say?" said Lalchand. "Locust Bottom?" The young couple ran to each other with their arms outstretched, but stopped, embarrassed, as they realised that everyone was watching. "Well, go on," said the king. "You might as well." So they kissed shyly and everyone cheered. "And now, I'd like an explanation, please," said the king. "I was a carpenter, Your Majesty," said Chang, "and I thought I ought to seek my fortune before I asked Lotus Blossom to marry me. So I went off and sought it, and that's what I'm doing here, Your Majesty." "Well, you'd better start singing them," said the king. So Chang ran back to the Melody Boys, and Rambashi counted them in, and they began to sing a close harmony song called "Down by the Irrawaddy." "They're very good, aren't they?" said Lalchand. "I'm amazed," said Leela. "After all the trouble they've had finding the right thing to do, who would have thought it?" The song came to an end, and the king led the applause. While Rambashi was announcing the next, Leela went to talk to Chulak and found him stroking Hamlet's trunk. The elephant looked happy, but of course he couldn't say so with everyone around. "Have you heard?" said Chulak. "Hamlet's going to get married." "Oh, well done, by the way. We heard the racket they made when you won. I always knew you would. And I've got my job back." Hamlet cuffed him gently around the head. "So Frangipani said yes," said Lila. "Congratulations, Hamlet. I'm so pleased. What made her change her mind?" "Me," said Chulak. "I went and told her about his gallant deeds up on Mount Merapi, and she was conquered. Actually, she said she'd loved him all the time, but she hadn't liked to say so. Old Uncle Rambashi's doing well, isn't he?" The audience was clapping and cheering as Rambashi announced the next song. When the Melody Boys were singing and swaying to "Save the Last Mango for Me," Leela wandered back to Lalchand, who was deep in talk with the 3 other firework-makers. They all stood up politely and asked her to join them. "I was just congratulating your pa on that mighty fine display," said Colonel Sparkington. "Half the credit goes to you, miss. That trick with the little bitty boats that all went out at once, that's a Lulu. How'd you work that stunt?" So Leela told them about the delayed action fuses, because there are no secrets among true artists. And Dr. Puffinflash told them the art of pink fire, and Signor Sorcerini told them how he made the octopus legs wave, and they all talked for hours and liked one another enormously. And very late, when they were extremely tired, and when even Rambashi's melody boys had run out of songs to sing, Leela and Lalchan found themselves alone in the great garden, on the grass under the warm stars, and Lalchan cleared his throat and looked embarrassed. "Leela, my dear," he said, "I've an apology to make." "Whatever for?" "Well, you see, I should have trusted you. I brought you up as a firework-maker's daughter. I should have expected you to want to be a firework-maker yourself. After all, you have the 3 gifts." "Oh yes, the 3 gifts. Razvani asked if I had them and I didn't know. But then he said I must have brought them after all. And what with rushing back to the city and preparing the display and worrying about whether we'd managed to save your life, I'd forgotten all about them. And I still don't know what they are." "Well, my dear, did you see the ghosts?" said Lalchand. "Yes, I did. They didn't bring the gifts, and they failed. But what are the 3 gifts?" "They are what all firework makers must have. They are all equally important, and 2 of them are no good without the 3rd. The first one is talent, and you have that, my dear. The second has many names: courage, determination, willpower. It's what made you carry on climbing the mountain when everything seemed hopeless." Leela was silent for a moment, and then said, "What's the 3rd?" "It's simply luck," he said. "It's what gave you good friends like Chulak and Hamlet, and brought them to you in time. Those are the 3 gifts, and you took them and offered them to Razvani as a firework maker should, and he gave you the royal sulphur in exchange." "But he didn't." "Yes, he did. He said it was an illusion." "In the eyes of Razvani, no doubt it is, but human beings call it wisdom. You can only gain that suffering and risk by taking the journey to Mount Merapi. It's what the journey is for. Each of our friends, the other firework makers, has made his own journey in a similar way, and so has Rambashi. So you see, you didn't come home empty-handed, Leela. You did bring back the royal sulphur." Leela thought of Hamlet and Frangipani, now happily engaged. She thought of Chulak, restored to his job, and Chang and Lotus Blossom, restored to each other. She thought of Rambashi and the Melody Boys, happily snoring in the Hotel Intercontinental, dreaming of the triumphant show business career that lay ahead of them. She thought of the other firework makers and how they'd welcomed her as one of them. And then she realised what she had learned. She suddenly saw that Dr. Puffinflash loved his pink fire, and Signor Sorcerini loved his octopus, and Colonel Sparkington loved his funny moon people. To make good fireworks, you had to love them. Every little sparkler or crackle dragon. That was it. You had to put love into your fireworks, as well as all the skill you had. And Dr. Puffinflash's pink fire really was very pretty. If they combined some of it with a little glimmer juice and some of that doubling back powder they'd never found a use for, they might be able to. She laughed and turned to Lalchand. "Now I see," she said. And so it was that Leela became a firework maker. The